chapters. It was 1,000,000 words long, and I took it round the publishers, and I could see they thought I was an absolute nutter. So they said, go home and cut it in half, which I did. So it ended up with 8 chapters and about 500,000 words. And when it went on sale, no one was interested. They couldn't give a damn about what was happening. So of course it didn't sell, and I have a lot of copies left over. But there is far more interest now. People, I think, are becoming aware of the problems ahead of them, but unfortunately officialdom, and by that I mean politicians, economists and the business executives, don't appear to be listening. Perhaps they're incapable of listening. Their mind may be on other matters, and they're certainly not acting as one would expect responsible people to act on our behalf.
Right. A thought that's going through my mind is that many times in history, prophets have emerged out of the masses of people to warn about the doom, the end of time. There's good biblical evidence, Jeremiah, all those guys saying, behold, the end is coming. And in some ways, for the people of Israel, the end did come because they get absorbed by the Syrians and Assyrians, etc. What's different about this time? The world continued on from the times of Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians, etc., and civilization continued. Why now is this prophetic message different?
Well, looking back in time, civilizations didn't continue. And Ronald Wright and Jared Diamond have written books on the collapse of civilizations. They are well worth reading because they detail how those civilizations of the past collapsed. The Mayan civilization, the Babylonian civilization, and so on. People were either overrun by terrorists from outside, or they collapsed because they couldn't produce enough food to keep themselves going. And I think we are approaching that situation. Very shortly, we're not going to be able to serve the 7 million people that we have on Earth.
Right.
Instead of thinking of a biblical doomsayer, some of whom were not that stupid and could see something coming. Think of Winston Churchill just before the Second World War. Huge amounts of information. He knew what was going on. A whole group of them knew what was coming on, and were trying to warn that there need to be much stronger action. At the moment, we're not going from an old book. We're not saying, look, God told us this and it's in the Old Testament or anything. We're talking about hard science, we're talking about measurements, we're talking about information coming from physicists of all types and demographers and people who've measured how much water there is and how much food is being produced, and all those people who've studied the oil system. Huge amounts of information all brought together, which makes a very consistent picture. And one thing to keep in mind is that the forecasts made 40 years ago are largely coming true. We've got some good tests of them. The oil peak has happened just as expected. The collapse of the world economy is just as I expected. I wrote a book called Excess Capital describing how this huge amount of money slushing around would finally bring down the economy. That's exactly what's happening. So I guess the pleasant side of all this is that we can chuckle, I told you so.
Right.
A mention of Winston Churchill is apposite because, yes, he did, prior to the Second World War, become thoroughly fed up with the procrastination that was going on. So he charged his people and government to get cracking and do something towards a war effort. But I maintain that the days of procrastination for our society, our world, are well and truly over. But we haven't put in place a Manhattan Project or a Marshall Project to take care of the situation. and we don't appear to be doing so.
I guess the question that arises then, and let me use the oil again as a basis of the question, what can we do? When oil runs out, there ain't any left in the ground, and you need to lubricate your car and put fuel in the tank, what are the alternatives?
Well, the easy answer is you don't have a car. You get on a bicycle or you walk.
But the bicycle that I ride has components made from the oil industry.
Yes, that's very true.
But there's a bigger question behind that question, which is perhaps we should be aware of this, researching it. I've already mentioned that the science establishment in New Zealand has been collapsed. Do you know, if you want to get funding for science in New Zealand, you can apply to a fund which is carefully controlled, which follows government guidelines, which are all about economic growth, and 80% of those applying fail. So you can see that the work that we want to do, that is scientific, is killed. So you've got to take the lid off that and let people who've done the science talk and listen to them and have a debate. You see, if the problem I face is that I don't have debates where people who disagree with me, we have an argy-bargy and see who's right and who's wrong and compare. We don't do that. They just say, shove off, mate, and that's about it.
Right, because I guess, are we at the point where we don't need another study, we don't need another commission, we actually need people to stand back and have an intelligent discussion on the data we already have in front of us?
Absolutely. There was a talk earlier this year by a visiting speaker about the climate change, and he covered all the material that we've become aware of. For example, the melting of the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica. Let me emphasise, this is truly frightening. This could give a huge rise in sea level in 10 or 20 years. I'm not saying it's going to happen, I'm just saying it's a possibility. And he concluded with, okay, we've got all the science, now let's talk about what we do about it. That really is the point. But it's hard to talk about what we do about it when there's so much denial around, where people say, we don't believe any of it. And you can't even discuss it.
I can understand denial in the sense from the average man on the street. This is too big.
No, but we've been out with our little signs, World Cup don't come, making idiots of ourselves, trying to get this point. And about half people come up and say they agree with us. There's a lot of men on the street out there who are pretty aware of what's going on. But somehow there's this big blanket thrown over society.
Because
I think it's very important that these matters be discussed in the public. They should be discussed in Parliament, brought out and discussed at public meetings by the mayors and councillors. They're not. They're shoved under the carpet still.
Okay, well that's part of the process that we're going to engage on over the next few weeks, I hope, because we're running to the end of our time here. So can we meet again and let's define some of those important issues and let's debate them. Let's talk about the things that are relevant to us, Kapiti, Wellington, New Zealand and global, and actually kick them around, and I'll play the advocate and disagree with you, and we'll see where we end up. How does that sound?
Sounds good.
Right.
Let's in particular look at growth, because that I consider to be one of the major problems.
Okay.
When you look around, everything is being promoted towards growth.
Right, should we kick off our next session with that very topic?
Brian?
Thank you. I've been talking with John Robinson and Derek Wilson, and the topic we have wandered around was the probable collapse of world society in 20 years. So folks, to hear the next conversation, tune in same time next week. There we go, session 1.
That would be good if